مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين.
اللهم صل على. Good job.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. لإيلاف قريش إيلافهم رحلة الشتاء والصيف وليعبدوا رب هذا البيت الذي أطعمهم من جوع وآمنهم من خوف.
اللهم صل على محمد. ما شاء الله.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Ar-Rahmanir-Rahim. Malik Yawmiddin. Iyyaka na'budu wa iyyaka nasta'in. Ihdina siratal mustaqim. Siratal ladzina an'amta 'alaihim ghayril maghdubi 'alaihim waladdallin.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم.
اللهم صل على محمد.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. قل أعوذ برب الفلق من شر ما خلق ومن شر غاسق إذا وقب ومن شر نفاسات في العقد ومن شر حاسد إذا حسد.
اللهم كل بر.
No.
Come on, you can do it.
No. Oh, why do I have to always do it? No.
Then I'll ask somebody else to do something else. MashaAllah, MashaAllah. Good job. Anybody else would like to recite? Whosoever recites, they get the rewards. Yeah, make sure we ask all the parents to sit with their children so they can focus more and keep your cell phones silent away. Everybody can wait next and use bathroom before, you know. And we would like to welcome Shaykh Faiyaz Jaffar with loudest of your salawat. Allahumma salli ala. No, it's fine. Salli ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad.
رحم الله من قرأ سورة المباركة الفاتحة. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وبه نستعين. صلى الله عليك يا سيدي يا مولاي يا رسول الله وعلى أهل بيتك المذلومين. صلى الله عليك يا سيدي يا مولاي مولاي وابن مولاي يا أبا عبد الله يا رحمة الله الواسعة ويا باب نجاة الأمة يا غريب يا مذلوم يا تشان كربلاء. ما خاب من تمسك بكم والعمن من لجأ إليكم سادتي. يا ليتنا كنا معكم فنفوز والله فوزا عظيما. قال الله العظيم في محكم كتابه الكريم وقوله الحق والأصدق القائلين أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم لقد كان في قصصهم إبرة لأولي الألباب آمنا بالله صدق الله العلي العظيم صلوا على محمد صلوا على Perhaps no one in the first century of Islam has as much written about him in a critical manner in the same way as Hassan ibn Ali ibn Abi Talib, the elder grandson of the Messenger of God, alayhi salam. And on this day, which is just passing us the 7th of the month of Safar, according to some historical reports, is the day of the martyrdom of Al-Hasan ibn Ali. And when we take a look at his life and when we take a look at his legacy, we see that so much in terms of contradicting historical reports has been written about the Imam Salamullah alayh. And sometimes many people, they might ask specifically, why is it that individuals as central to Islamic tradition, like that of the elder son of Ali and Fatima, the eldest grandson of the greatest of God's creations, why is it that individuals and personalities like him are so open to debate when it comes toward matters of historical criticism? We have one report, for instance, that tells us that the martyrdom of Al-Hasan alayhi salam was on the 7th of the month of Safar, while others state that it was at the end of the month of Safar. Some state that his birth was on the 15th of the month of Ramadan, while others conflict and say no, that his birth was actually a few months later. Some reports, they state that the Imam alayhi salam was poisoned by his wife, Ja'da bint Ash'ath ibn Qais, while others state that the Imam alayhi salam may have died due to other means, and even perhaps natural means. When it comes toward Al-Hasan ibn Ali alayhi salam, some state that the Imam alayhi salam didn't have the same political shrewdness or the same political acumen as Ali or as Hussein, his father and his brother, peace and blessings be upon them. While others state that the only thing that concerned Al-Hasan ibn Ali alayhi salam, like many of us have heard, na'udhu billahi min dhalik, was the opposite gender and marrying as many women as possibly could. You take a look, report after report, historical record after historical record, and like I said before, there is no one who has been criticized in the first century of Islam in the same way as this incredible, perfect, infallible Imam who comes from the progeny of Ali and Fatima, the grandson of the Messenger of God, sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sallam. And for today's discussion, insha'Allah ta'ala, I want to reflect upon the misinformation that we hear about Al-Hasan ibn Ali alayhi salam in 3 different dimensions. The first dimension is in terms of understanding how history is recorded in accordance with various different methods and perspectives within historiography. The second dimension is in terms of understanding the 3 stages of the recording of Islamic history specifically. And the third dimension is in terms of understanding some specific factors that contribute to the misinformation around Al-Hasan ibn Ali, salamullah alayh. So let's jump right into dimension number 1 of the conversation. When it comes toward history in the first place, like every single one of us know, history itself is a fallible science. It has the opportunity to make errors, many a times because the individuals who are recording history, they enter into its recording through their own methods of bias. So let me give you an example of exactly how this manifests and how this takes place. If you take a look, for instance, at the world that we live in, and the political and social environment that we are currently in this city, in this state, in this country, in light of everything that went on just yesterday, we know that there are two very distinct schools politically and ideologically with regards to how they see the incidents in local politics in this country. There is the right and there is the left. There is the Republican and there's the Democrat. Their media sources all dictate and all speak to how they see and how they understand truths. And like we know, we have our own methodologies by which we determine, and we know which one of them might be closer to the truth than the other. Undoubtedly, at the end of the day, every single media outlet is going to seek toward maintaining their sense of a hegemonic ideology when they want to present their truths, because at the end of the day, they want people to listen to their news, follow their politicians, and vote for them in the upcoming elections. That's the world that we live in, and every single one of us understand that and realize that and actualize that on a day-to-day basis. When it comes toward the historical method that many of you might be familiar, you studied in high school, many of you, if you might be students of the humanities in any college campus in this country, many of you are familiar with the historical method, which has three primary frames to it. The first frame of the historical method is toward gathering together as many possible primary sources as the historian can possibly gather. It's what is known as the heuristic model, for those of you who might be familiar with nerd talk. What the historian seeks to do is gathering together as much as we possibly can with regards to primary sources. So let's say, for instance, someone wants to study the Civil War of this country, or they want to study the American Revolution. So what they're going to try to do is gather together as many primary first-hand sources as they possibly can. Were there any letters written by George Washington? Was there any statements made by John Adams that were transcribed? And so on and so forth. Again, in order to gather as much as we can when it comes toward the historians and the data, the letters, the artifacts, whatever we can about that day that they were living in. And now let us seek toward understanding how people saw the truth who lived in that day, in 1776, for instance, or whatever it might be. Follow so far? This is stage number one of the historical method. The second stage of the historical method is to not only take a look at the first-hand sources, but is to take a look at historians who may have written about that in the past. Because a historian who is closer to that time, more likely than not, they had a really deep understanding and awareness of how people understood the reality and the facts of that incident taking place in the early or in the late 1770s, for instance. If I were to bring the example home a little bit closer, let's say that my children, our children, all of these young kids sitting in the front, 50 years from now, they wanted to study the COVID-19 pandemic in the United States and how it influenced our communities, how it influenced Shia Muslim religious communities. They are going to have first-hand experience because many of them might have lived through it, though they don't remember, but they know that their parents lived through it, their grandparents lived through it, their communities lived through it. So they can go and ask their mom and their dad and their grandma and their grandfather. They can go and ask the leaders of the community, what did you guys do during Muharram in the middle of the pandemic? You guys did Majlis on Zoom? Like, what was that about? Why did you guys do that? That's ridiculous. But at the end of the day, they have first-hand sources in order to understand and identify what were the obstacles, the realities, the challenges, so on and so forth. Now let's say that their grandchildren, our great-great-great-grandchildren, they decided that 100 years from now, they also wanted to study the same exact subject. More likely than not, they won't have so many of those primary individuals who are eyewitness observers toward the COVID-19 pandemic. But what they will do is they will take a look at the reports written by their great-grandparents, these children sitting in the front, in order to understand what society and what the situation was like during the course of that day. Everyone following? Sorry, it's a bit complicated, but we got this. So the second method, or the second stage of the historical method, is through gathering together individuals who may have been historians who sought toward understanding or telling the truth of what happened during any time period within human history. Then the third and the final stage of the historical method is what is known as synthesis. You gather together all of the sources, the primary, the secondary, the thirdly, the whatever, as much as you possibly can, and then you start, as a historian, to tell your story, and you start to identify gaps in those who may have narrated that which had taken place before you. What could these gaps be? Like we said before, the gaps could be bias. The gaps could be the fact that we only have one side of the story. Who tells history except for the one who wins the battle? The victor is the one who writes history. And you start to identify those gaps, and then you start to figuring out ways to fill them in order that we are able to share our own narrative. Hear all of this for one moment. Why this is so important when it comes to us understanding the history of the Imams of Ahlul Bayt, peace and blessings be upon them, is because we have to submit to the fact that our religious leaders, our masters and our guides, and they are the family of the Messenger of God, peace and blessings be upon them, they were never on the side of authority when it comes toward matters of Islamic history, but rather they were always seen as the opposition force toward the norm. And those who were writing and documenting historical records and dates and speaking toward matters of truth, at the end of the day, they were crafting it within their own narrative, and there's no doubt about that. So when it comes toward the tragedy of Karbala and the story of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam, someone says, one individual narrates that Qasim died like this, while another one states that Qasim dies like this. One says that the lady who said this was Zainab, while another one says the lady who said that was Kulthum. Someone says that Imam al-Hussein killed X amount of people, while another historical report says he kills Y amount of people, so on and so forth. We see a discrepancy in an incident that is as magnificent and as important and is as engaging as the day of Ashura, and we see the debate when it comes toward matters and details around history. Again, we have to ask the fundamental, the very first question, which is who is the one who narrated the story of Karbala, for instance? What are the sources of this tragedy? How did it come to be? How do we have the narratives that we have today? And where do the fabrications or the exaggerations that we many a times might hear on the minbar, where do they come from as well? All of this requires its own specific study and its own specific detail and discourse, which obviously we don't have the opportunity to discuss this evening. But that being said, my friends, I say all of this as an introduction for us to understand that fundamentally, when it comes toward us understanding the life, the legacy, the history of Imam Hassan ibn Ali, alayhi salatu wasalam, we have to understand where are we getting the narrative from in the first place. Once we understand that the narrative itself might have its own problems and its challenges and its gaps, then we're able to figure out exactly why there is so much misinformation spread about the grandson of the Messenger of God, alayhi salatu wasalam. So this brings me then toward the second dimension of the discussion. This is super important. The second dimension of the discussion, I want to reflect upon the three stages of the recording of Islamic history. Now follow along for me for just a moment. Again, I know this stuff might be a little bit boring, but at the end of the day, again, it undoubtedly serves a super important purpose in us understanding the legacy of the Imams of Ahlul Bayt. Peace and blessings be upon them. The recording of history in the early stages of Islam goes through three primary periods. The first period is when the recording of history in a written manner was banned in accordance with the early caliphate. Let me give you this report in order to present a sense of clarity. In the hadith narrated in Sahih Muslim, it states from the Messenger of God sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sallam, Allahumma salli ala, in which he states, in accordance with their report, he states, لا تكتبوا عني شيئا إلا القرآن. Don't write anything that you hear from me, except that it is the ayat and the verses of the Quran. فمن كتب عني شيئا غير القرآن فليمحه. And that anyone who has written anything that I have stated other than the ayat of the Quran, then delete it, then erase it, then get rid of it. Now, of course, we don't have this particular hadith within our canonical works, but many from within our brothers and sisters from Ahl Sunnah, they would defend this particular report by stating the importance of memorizing the whole Quran. and that there may have been a possibility, one way or another, whereby the early Muslim community would have made a mistake and had accidentally preserved a hadith of the Prophet of God and included it in the verses of the Quran. Of course, we would push back, and we have many responses to this. The biggest question that we need to ask ourselves in this very first stage of the recording of Islamic history is, why was it prohibited for the early Muslim community to record the ahadith or to write down the life and the legacy of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam? Hear me out for a moment. This is the greatest creation, and there is no second. This is Rasulullah Muhammad, who through, within Islamic law, we are able to deduce the majority of law via his words and via his sunnah. That we are able to understand and interpret the ayat of the Holy Quran via his life and via his legacy. And the first individual to end this prohibition on writing down the ahadith of the Prophet or the history of the early Muslim community was during the time of the Umayyad Caliph, Umar ibn Abdul Aziz, who made many reforms, and many of you may be familiar. But this takes place more than 100 years after the hijrah of Rasulullah Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Meaning again, that the first time someone begins to write down history and record history and record the ahadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam is more than 100 years after the Prophet alaihi salatu wasalam. That means that all of these incidences that have taken place in the political realm as we know it today, no one writes down anything for 100 years. It only gets passed down by oral tradition. And like every single one of us know, when we pass down something via oral tradition, there's a higher room for error. How many of you have played the game telephone? You guys know what I'm talking about? Someone says one thing, and by the time you get to the end of the room, the truth that was initially stated is totally different. Sometimes people, they do it to be funny and to fabricate the truth on purpose. But in other circumstances, everyone is sincere, but they just made a mistake. They didn't hear properly. Now, I want you to understand this point for 1 second. The first time someone writes down anything about history of the Prophet ﷺ is more than 100 years after the Messenger of God ﷺ. And this brings me then to the second stage when it comes toward the preservation of Islamic history. This is finally when there was a sense of freedom of reign toward writing things down and preserving this history. What happens? Like we said before, the Umayyad Caliph, Umar ibn Abdul Aziz, he assumes power. Again, 100 years after the passing of the Prophet, he is a contemporary of Imam al-Baqir, alayhi salatu wassalam. And so, Umar ibn Abdul Aziz, he realizes that around him, most of the companions of the Prophet and the children of the companions of the Prophet have passed away. And now, if we lose whatever legacy that we have from the companions of the Prophet and from their children, which might have been taken to memory via this path of oral tradition, we're going to lose a lot. So let us start to record and let us start to compile as much as we possibly can, because we are about to lose the legacy of our ancestors. You know, sometimes when we get a little bit older, we also see those around us also getting older. And when you see those who you know have knowledge and have wisdom are getting older and they're in the last leg of their life, we want to spend time with them because we want to learn from them and we want to appreciate their experiences. So we sit with them and we talk to them and so on and so forth. Perhaps during this time period, the early Muslim community had this awakening. They said, oh man, if we don't record as much as we possibly can and gather together the life and the legacy of our Prophet, it's going to get lost during the time of our children. So let us do the absolute best that we can in order to preserving it. And undoubtedly we believe and we can assume that this early Muslim community did it with a good intention, that they sought toward preserving their tradition and their history and our history. But at the end of the day, what we see is that the first historians that begin to compile these works, what happens? Again, every individual is prone to their own baggage. They're also prone to their own bias. They're also prone towards speaking about their families and about their heritages and about the tribes that they came from. They wanted to propagate how they were at the forefront of supporting the Prophet ﷺ, that they were the ones who were the difference makers in the early Muslim community. And they sought toward doing everything possibly that they could out of a normal human instinctual response in order to uplifting themselves and their tribes and their families and their communities, like every single one of us oftentimes naturally do. In other words, that during this period 100 years later, there is a bias. But at the same time, this is a community of Arabs who in that day didn't have a method when it comes toward preserving history, or didn't have a method when it comes toward writing or preserving or studying historical works in the first place. Like we know from the early Muslim communities, everything was passed down via oral tradition. Most of that community didn't know how to read and write. 100 years earlier, they were burying their daughters alive. So what's happening during this time period? An individual, for instance, who goes to school and who studies historiography, for instance, a student who's sitting in this gathering who studied political science, or a student who studies law, a student who lives and studies within the humanities, they understand that there are certain methodologies when it comes toward the recording of history. That community didn't know how to do that. So they just sought toward gathering together as much as they can. And when there's no methodology, oftentimes the knowledge that you're preserving is not going to take you to where you want it to go. And this brings me then toward the third stage. And again, the most important one. In the third stage of this preservation of early Islamic history, undoubtedly there was a whole and a great deal of government influence. Hear me out. During the time of the Umayyads, we know their strong animosity and their opposition toward Ali and toward Fatima and toward Hassan and Hussein, peace and blessings be upon them. Muawiyah, for instance, would come and say, what is the hadith about Ali? And they would state that the hadith of Ali states, أَنَا مَدِينَةُ الْعِلْمِ وَعَلِيٌّ بَابُهَا, that I am the city of knowledge and Ali is its door. So he said, okay, I want you to fabricate another hadith. First he would say, for instance, let's change the name. They said, oh Muawiyah, you can't do that. Everyone knows this hadith is for Ali alayhi salam. He said, okay, no worries. So state that X is the window and that the house is still the Prophet of God, for instance. Let's have, for instance, Y the back door toward the house in order to whitewash, in order to diminish the rank and the station of Ali ibn Abi Talib alayhi salam. He would state, what do they say about Fatima? They would state, Fatima Sayyidatun Nisa al-Alameen, that Fatima is the leader of the women of the worlds. He would state, okay, great. Can we remove the name of Fatima? They would say, no, O Muawiyah, you can't do that. Everyone knows this hadith is narrated for Fatima alayhi salam. So he stated, okay, how can we diminish the rank of Fatima alayhi salam? Let us say that these 5 women, that they are the ones who are determined or destined for paradise, for instance. They would state, what do they say about Al-Hasan and Al-Husayn? They would state, Hasani wal-Husayn Sayyida Shababi Ahl al-Jannah, that they are the leaders of the youth of paradise. He would say, can we remove the names of Hassan and Husayn and plug me and my brother, for instance? They said, no, we can't do that. Everyone knows this hadith is narrated for Hassan and Husayn. He said, okay, no worries. Let us say that X and Y, that they are the leaders of the elders of paradise. Anything that they could toward diminishing the light of Ahlul Bayt, alayhim as-salam. This was the role played undoubtedly by the Umayyads. Later along the line, we see during the time of the Abbasids, there was a very different method employed by their political elite. What they sought toward doing, again, though they didn't have strong animosity in a very blatant way toward Ali and Fatima and Hassan and Hussein, they undoubtedly wanted to preserve their political hegemony. And they undoubtedly wanted to preserve, at the same time, their ideological narrative. So every opportunity that they got, they would seek toward diminishing the station of Ahlul Bayt, peace and blessings be upon them. Let me give you a couple of examples. Amongst them is the example of Mutawakkil al-Abbasi. Mutawakkil al-Abbasi, many of you are familiar. He is the one who is responsible for poisoning Imam Muhammad al-Jawad alayhi salam, the 9th Imam of Ahlul Bayt. Mutawakkil al-Abbasi famously is the one who sought toward destroying the shrine of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam 3 to 13 times, in contrast with different historical reports. It is stated that one of Mutawakkil's children or if it was Mutawakkil himself, had employed a man by the name of Ibn Sakit, who was a companion of Imam Ali al-Hadi, the 10th Imam alayhi salam, toward tutoring his two children the Arabic language. Ibn Sakit, he was known for his eloquence, he was known for his expertise in Arabic grammar and so on and so forth. And he appoints this man toward living in the court in order toward teaching his two children the Arabic language. And it is said that one day, after many months of them being tutored by Ibn Sakit, he goes up to them. And he goes up to him and he says, "Oh, Ibn Sakit, tell me, how good are my two sons? Are they better than Hassan and Hussein?" To which he responds with this epic line, Ibn Sakit, he says, "La wallah, bal qambar afdal min ibnaik." He says, "Are you kidding me?" He says, "I swear to God that Qambar, the slave of Ali, Hassan, and Hussein, is better than your two children." They took Ibn Sakit and they cut off his tongue and they beat him up until he died. Rahmatullah, radwanullahi ta'ala alayh. I fast forward to a man by the name of Imam al-Nisa'i. Imam al-Nisa'i writes a famous book known as Fada'il Ali ibn Khasa'is Amir al-Mu'mineen Ali alayhi salam. When you guys go home tonight, not while I'm talking, go and Google Imam al-Nisa'i. Imam al-Nisa'i writes a famous work that exists till today known as Sunan al-Nisa'i. It's one of the most important and the 6 central books within Sunni Hadith. Imam al-Nisa'i had gone to Damascus many years later, after Muawiyah, after the Umayyads, so on and so forth, perhaps during the time of the Ghaybat al-Sughra. And he goes toward Damascus in order to sit with some teachers and gather some texts, and he was a scholar in his own right. And he saw within the city of Damascus that there was a really strong animosity toward Ali alayhi salam. Again, amongst the giants of Sunni Hadith. Imam al-Nisa'i, he sits and he asks people, he says, "Why don't any of you respect Ali alayhi salam?" They said, "This is Muawiyah town," right? 150 years, 200 years later, they said, "Ali has nothing on Muawiyah, na'udhu billah." And he saw that all of these people, they were praising Muawiyah, and he felt that he needed to do something about it, again, in order to create a sense of communal reawakening within his own Sunni Muslim community. So Imam al-Nisa'i, he decides that he wants to write a book known as Khasa'is Amir al-Mu'mineen Ali, the merits of the commander of the faithful Ali. So he gathers together a book, which again still exists till this very day, which gathers together all of the merits of Ali alayhi salam, all of the hadith where the Prophet alayhi salam praises Ali ibn Abi Talib in accordance with their ahadith. And he presents it in front of the community. And they say, oh Imam, why don't you write a book about the first caliph? He says, "Okay, I'll write a book about the first caliph." "Why don't you write a book about Muawiyah?" He says, "No, I'll write a book about the second caliph," and so on and so forth. One day it is said that he was lecturing in Damascus, because he lived there for some time, and he was reading out of this book that he wrote, the merits of Ali ibn Abi Talib, because he wanted again to explain to his community that Ali is not the figure that you think that he is. He is praised, he's beloved by all. So at this moment it is said that a man from his congregation stood up and said, "Oh Imam Nisa'i, you wrote this book on the merits of Ali, but you've never written a book on the merits of our master Muawiyah." To which he says, "I don't know any merit of Muawiyah other than the Prophet alayhi salam states, 'O Muawiyah, may your stomach never be satiated.'" It is stated that they pull down an-Nisa'i from the minbar and they beat him up, and he returns back with wounds back to Mecca, where he eventually died from that assault. Imam al-Nisa'i, again, one of the kings of Sunni Hadith narrative. What I'm trying to say, my friends, is that when it comes toward these frames within the development of early Islamic history, there was a whole host of politicization that contributed toward the lack of awareness and understanding of the role and the rank of the Imams of Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam. So when it comes toward the third dimension, specifically targeting this misinformation of Imam Hassan alayhi salatu wasalam, it's so evident why we have whatever it is that we have in animosity toward Imam al-Hassan alayhi salatu wasalam. Let me explain. On one level, you have all of the literature that has been cultivated by the Umayyads in animosity toward Imam al-Hasan alayhi salatu wasalam. Let me put it in perspective for all of us. Imam al-Hasan's imamate was for more than a decade. And the Imam alayhi salatu wasalam had to deal with the onslaught of everything that he had to deal with when it comes toward the propaganda machine that was Muawiyah and the Umayyads in Damascus. And every opportunity that Muawiyah had toward diminishing, toward isolating the station of Imam al-Hasan salamullah alayhi, he would do exactly just that. And it's obvious what the Umayyads did in order to discount Imam al-Hasan alayhi salatu wasalam, to the extent that even in that battle, when they sought toward reconciling and writing that treaty, which we can talk about in another day, between Imam al-Hasan and Muawiyah, amongst the staunchest and amongst the closest companions and confidants of Imam al-Hasan alayhi salam, in accordance with some historians, even a personality like that of Hujr ibn Adi. Hujr ibn Adi is one amongst the most beloved companions of Ali. Everyone knows how Hujr ibn Adi dies as he's praising Ali ibn Abi Talib alayhi salam, along with his children. He goes to Imam al-Hasan alayhi salam and he says, "Oh grandson of the Messenger of God, what are you doing? Why are you signing a treaty with this man?" That even someone as loyal and as beloved as Hujr, again, he also questioned at that moment the validity of the station of of Imam al-Hasan alayhi salam, because of the rhetoric being sent out and spewed out by Muawiyah. I want you to imagine, my friends, you know how difficult it is when your own family, they don't agree with the stance that you've taken? It's hard. I want you to imagine when you are opposing someone who is so staunch in opposition to you, and you have to be patient and let them assume a position of power, when you have to submit towards something, even though you know that you're on the right. It hurts, man. It hurts a lot. What this demonstrates to us is not only the pain and the difficulty and the patience of Imam Hasan alayhi salatu wasalam, but in addition to, it teaches us a little bit about the socio-political climate that the Imam alayhi salam had to live in. This is on one end, on the end of the Umayyads. When it comes toward the Abbasids, and again, why I say that Imam al-Hasan alayhi salam is attacked more than anyone else within the first century of Islam, is because the Abbasids many years later, though they had no strict opposition toward Imam al-Hasan alayhi salatu wasalam, many of those who came from the lineage of Imam al-Hasan alayhi salam, they sought toward revolting against the Abbasid Caliphate. Let me just say this one point in parenthesis. Imam al-Hasan alayhi salam has many children. Amongst his children, like we know, are Qasim ibn al-Hasan, who dies on the day of Ashura. Amongst the children of Imam al-Hasan is Abdullah ibn Hasan, this young boy who in the last moments of the life of Imam al-Husayn alayhi salam, he goes out and tries to defend Imam al-Husayn alayhi salam, only to have an arrow that strikes his chest and he dies on the lap of Sayyid al-Shuhada al-Husayn salamullah alayhi. The eldest son of Imam al-Hasan is a man by the name of Hasan al-Muthanna, Hasan the second. Hasan al-Muthanna also is present on Ashura, and he fights on the day of Ashura in Karbala, and he is heavily wounded. At the end of the night, on the night of the 11th of Muharram, they see that Hasan al-Muthanna was alive. He was wounded, but he was alive. And when they decided whether or not they should kill him or just imprison him, it is said that his mother, many of her tribesmen were on the army of Umar ibn Sa'd, and said that this boy, he comes from our tribe, so in order to respect us, don't kill him, but just include him as one of the prisoners. Eventually he goes back to Medina, and the line of the Hassani Sadat, they continue from Hasan al-Muthanna, Hasan the second. Hasan al-Muthanna has many children, and he migrates to different parts, and their children obviously migrate to different parts of the world, and so on and so forth. And from their line, there was a strong animosity that they had toward the Abbasids at numerous different junctures due toward the socio-political circumstances. And it is stated that Mansur al-Dawaniqi, who is the individual who was responsible for poisoning Imam Jaffar al-Sadiq alayhi salam during his caliphate, he writes a letter to one of these Hassani Sada. And he says that again, in order to fabricate, as they would often do. He said that you are a coward in the same way that your grandfather Hassan was a coward. In the same way that he refuses to fight, you will refuse to fight me, for instance. He's basically asking him to come and fight me. And a lot of this narrative about Imam al-Hassan alayhi salatu wasalam not fighting and not being courageous and not being brave and fighting against Muawiyah and so on and so forth actually develops during this period of time, during the Abbasid Caliphate. And in order to claim illegitimacy toward all of these Hassani Sadat who were at war with the Abbasids, they would start to say that your mothers are illegitimate. You are illegitimate children from your mothers. And again, these rumors spread like wildfire. Again, in the age where there's no social media, the government makes a stance and they state that this is the truth. And over here you see all of these historical records that then come forth and they state that Imam al-Hassan alayhi salam had many wives, and from these wives he had many children, and from these children come from these line of Hassani Sada and so on and so forth. Follow what I'm saying? In conclusion, my friends, when it comes toward the life and the legacy of Imam Hassan ibn Ali alayhi salatu wasalam, there's a reason why we have the misinformation that we do. And it's so important for us to appreciate and to understand and to recognize just the beauty of the character and the legacy of the Imam alayhi salam, because in spite of all of this, we still have the anecdotes that we do. We still have some ahadith of the Imam alayhi salam that we do. We still have this generosity that we learn from the Imam alayhi salam. We see the courage and the bravery of the Imam alayhi salam. We see the eloquence of the Imam alayhi salam. We can see through the lines and see the political acumen of the Imam alayhi salatu wasalam. That no matter how much they sought toward diminishing the light of the grandson of the Messenger of God, salamullah alayhi, that we gather here year after year to maintain this sense of commitment and dedication out of our love for him, salamullah alayhi. That the hardship that he had to go through was decades after his life and centuries after his life till this very day. But in the course of his life, he had to deal with that which even lived within his own home. Salamullah ala Aba Muhammad. It is stated that on a day like today, when that poison began to inflict the body of Imam al-Hassan alayhi salatu wassalam, that he digested it into his body and it began to pain him in a painstaking way that we could never imagine. And then he would vomit consistently during the course of the final days and final moments of his life. And it is stated in a report that Imam al-Hassan alayhi salam is in the state where he's in pain and he's in difficulty and he's in hardship. And Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam comes to console him. And at this moment, he sees the Imam alayhi salam overwhelmed with tears. And he states, "Oh Aba Abdullah," he says, "why do I see you overwhelmed with tears?" He says, "Oh my brother Hassan," he says, "because I see you in this situation and this circumstance, in this pain that you're enduring due to this poison that has been inflicted on your body by Muawiyah." So at this moment, Imam al-Hassan alayhi salam says, "Don't cry for me, but rather be patient. Because I see a day, not far from today, where there are 30,000 men with sticks and with spears and with swords, all ready to shed your sacred blood." And then he utters this line, he states, "La yawm ka yawmik ya Aba Abdullah." For there is no day like your day, O Aba Abdullah. It is stated that at this moment, Imam al-Hassan alayhi salam, he looks toward Aba Abdullah. He says, "Oh Imam al-Hussein," he says, "bring me a piece of cloth." So at this moment, he rushes and brings him a piece of cloth, and at that moment, he covers the pail that he was vomiting in. At this moment, Imam al-Hussein says, "Oh my brother, why are you covering this pail?" He says, "Because I'm afraid that if Zainab alayhi salam were to enter into this room and see me, that she would be too overwhelmed with grief. But I ask you, O Aba Muhammad, that on that day in the last moment of your life, you were thinking about what Zainab alayhi salam would have to endure if she saw your state. But I ask you, oh Aba Muhammad, do you know what Zainab had to deal with on the 10th of Muharram? I'll give you one glimpse. That Hassan alayhi salam was worried and concerned about his sister. Let me give you perhaps the most difficult moment in the life of Zainab alayhi salam. It is said, as the poet states, that when Shimr runs out of the tent, Zainab, she runs up the hill. And when Shimr sits on the chest of Hussein, then Zainab alayhi salam, she reaches the climax of that hill. You've been to Karbala, you've climbed on that mountain, that hill, Tila Zainabi. It is said that when Shimr removes the dagger, ready to shed and sever the head of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam, at this moment Zainab, she stood and she froze, and she thought for one moment, should I go and should I defend my brother Aba Abdullah al-Hussein? And perhaps she even made strides, but as she was making strides, she also heard calls coming out from behind her, Al-Atash ya Amma, that we are thirsty, O our aunt. So at this moment Zainab alayhi salam, she stood firm. In front of her she saw the head of Aba Abdullah being severed, and behind her she saw Sakina weeping and crying of her thirst. A few moments later she sees the head of Hussein on a spear, and a few moments later she sees the children of Abu Abdullah al-Hussein being slapped on the night of the 11th of Muharram. على لعنة الله على لعنة الله على القوم الظالمين إنا لله وإنا إليه راجعون. We raise our hands, we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, by the grief in our hearts and the tears in our eyes, we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to grant us a life that resembles the life of Muhammad wa Ali Muhammad, and a death that resembles the death of Muhammad wa Ali Muhammad. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to allow for us to be amongst those who are exposed to the true light of Muhammad wa Ali Muhammad, and to never separate us from them in this dunya or in the barzakh or in the akhirah. برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين. وصلى اللهم على محمد وآله الطاهرين. If we could ask you all to recite one surah al-Mubarakat al-Fatiha, but before that, one salawat ala Muhammad wa Ali Muhammad. Al-Fatiha. Ya Hussein.
Ya Hussein, Ya Hussein. Karbala, Karbala, Karbala hai, Karbala, 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 Karbala hai, Karbala. जाने वाले करबला के करबला ले चल मुझे, जाने वाले करबला के रोज़ाए शब्बीर पर दूंगा दुआले चल मुझे, जाने वाले करबला के है जहाँ गंजे शहीदा, है जहाँ नहरे फुरात, जिस जगह सैयद मेरा प्यासा रहा ले चल मुझे, जाने वाले करबला के करबला ले चल मुझे, जाने वाले करबला के जिस जगह जागी थी किस्मत हुर की वो देखूंगा मैं, आसियो पर कैसे होती है अताले चल मुझे, जाने वाले करबला के करबला ले चल मुझे जाने वाले करबला के इस कदर नादार उज़्ज़ा में सफ़र कुछ भी नहीं दोष पर अपनी दिखा कर ए हवाले चल मुझे जाने वाले करबला के करबला ले चल मुझे जाने वाले करबला के करबला ले